as I just mentioned to you, a big chunk of Toronto's housing spending relies on the feds. It gets worse. Yesterday, the Ontario government released their mini budget, or they call it their economic update. And their economic update for the year that started in the current year is this year, 2010-2011. We're still in that fiscal year. They're showing a huge drop in their affordable housing spending as well. This red line is the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing spending on affordable housing, and it's going from about $650 million down to about $50 million. So the federal government is cutting funding, the provincial government is cutting funding, and the City of Toronto relies heavily on those two levels of government, so that's bad news for the City of Toronto. So the Mayor has said, our executioner-in-chief, that every department has to have a mandatory 10% cut. So I gave you some of the overall numbers for shelter support and housing, and I want to ask you where you think the cut should come. There's the social housing spending, which overall the gross amount is $657. The amount taxpayers pay is $223. Should they be cutting social housing? In other words, selling off more TCH units and telling housing providers that you have to start evicting some of your tenants because we're not going to subsidize your units anymore? Should they be cutting homeless hostel services, which a gross budget of $125 million, net $57 million? Should they cut affordable housing, which is what they've already said that they want to do? They want to cut the city's affordable housing budget, which is $88 million. But the interesting thing is they won't save a single penny if they do that, because not a penny of affordable housing spending actually comes from city. Every single penny, all those bureaucrats that Phil was talking about are such good activists, their salaries are actually being paid for by the federal and provincial government. So they can cut that and it won't save a penny for taxpayers in Toronto. Or they can cut the supports budget for housing and homelessness, which is some of the things that Linsey was talking about, $43 million. So this is the big budget question that we'll be looking for on Monday, is where is the 10% cut going to be, a mandatory 10% cut coming from? Or can shelter support and housing do what the police did and basically say to the mayor, sorry, we're not going to cut, in fact, we're going to increase, and we've got more guns than you do, so too bad. Now, shelter support housing doesn't have any guns. But anyway, this is from last year's budget. This is the projection for the number of new affordable homes that are supposed to be built in Toronto this year, next year, and the year after. 1,200. It looks suspiciously even. That's because it's a fictional number. But nevertheless, their goal is to build 1,200 new units a year, which would be great because they haven't ever done that before, but it would be nice if they could. This year, this past year, they went slightly over 1,000 units, which was a good year for them. If the City Core Services review process has its way, we will see those eliminated. There'll be no new affordable housing built in the City of Toronto. The bottom graph is perhaps a little bit less important. It's just the repair budget. It's less important unless you happen to live in a home that's in bad state of repair, then it's very, very important for you. So I want to mention that I've had some handouts, some sheets. One of my colleagues, Sheila Block, an economist who works with the Wellesley Institute, has produced a budget analysis paper which is surprisingly interesting and easy to read. So those of you that think economists don't know how to engage people in real language, pick up Sheila's report or pick up the document at the back, which is the summary of it. Sheila's taken the budget hysteria. You keep hearing about the $774 million budget shortfall, and the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Well, every year Toronto starts its budget process with hundreds of millions of dollars of budget shortfall. That's how the process works. And every year they get it down to zero. That's how the process works. This year is no different. Don't believe the mayor that there's never been a year like this in the history of Toronto. Every year is like this in the history of Toronto. And if the mayor says, we got to cut, we got to sell off Toronto community housing, we got to do this and do that because we've never had a year like this, the mayor is wrong. This is a year like every other year, and there are simple things that can be done to address this, and Sheila has set them out, including stopping the stupid idea of tax freeze and actually having a tax increase that relates to the rate of inflation. So just before I go, I want to say that there's two issues that are not budgetary issues, but you should be very concerned about. One issue is an issue that I can only describe as being remarkably cruel, and that is a proposal that has been slipped into a very boring bylaw called the Streets Bylaw. The Streets Bylaw is a harmonized bylaw. It takes all of the old bylaws from the old city of North York and East York and Toronto and so on, and it brings all those bylaws together so they all are more or less the same. And what they've done in the guise of harmonizing all the bylaws, they've snuck in a new proposal, which was never in any of the other bylaws, and it's a proposal to ban camping, dwelling, and they have a few other words, on the streets of Toronto. And you think, well, who camps on the streets of Toronto other than occupied people? But they have sadly had their comeuppance from the courts. But the answer, of course, is that these bylaws are routinely used throughout North America against homeless people. They're used as a way of targeting activities associated with homelessness and driving homeless people off the streets and into jails or elsewhere. In British Columbia, the exact same bylaw, the city of Victoria, the exact same bylaw with almost the exact same wording was thrown out by the BC Supreme Court, the highest court in British Columbia, saying it was unconstitutional, a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You can't make it illegal for people to sleep because it's biologically necessary. Everyone has to sleep. And if you say you can't sleep, then you're actually denying a fundamental biological reality. You're depriving people of their right to life under Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was a remarkably sensible decision from the court, but it's a decision that's been made by court after court after court in the United States and Canada. When these bylaws get challenged, the courts always say, no, you can't do this, you can't make it illegal to sleep, you can't make it illegal. There are bylaws about urinating in public. You can't make it illegal to urinate if people don't have somewhere, a home to urinate in. They have to urinate. It's a biological necessity. Sorry for using that language, but I don't think that's a revelation to anyone in this room. We all need to go, and when we have to go, we have to go. And you can't make it a criminal offense. So anyway, the streets bylaw, during the consultation process, we went to the city staff agreed with us, they withdrew the anti-camping provision. We went to shelter, support and housing, and they agreed, and they said, doesn't need to be in the bylaw. Came back to council, and then, sure enough, Councillor David Shiner brought it back in as an amendment, and it's back onto the agenda again. And what we've said is that, without wanting to threaten him, that if this bylaw goes forward with that amendment, Ken Hale, personally, going to go right to the Supreme Court of Canada or some other lawyer that came from Canada. And I just want to say to you that I feel very strongly about this, not because this is a big issue, not because we're saying that it's acceptable for people to camp on the streets, that it's okay for homeless people to sleep on sidewalks, because nobody thinks that's acceptable. I sure don't think. I think it's an abomination and a shame and an indictment on the city of Toronto that there are homeless people who are forced to sleep on the streets of Toronto. So we're not trying to defend the right of people to sleep on the streets. We're simply saying you can't make it a criminal offense to be homeless in the city of Toronto. And what you've got to do, if you want to get the people of Toronto off the streets, is make sure there's good housing, make sure there's good transitions and other supports, make sure Linsey and her people get the money they need, make sure Phil gets his project up and running. So anyway, that's the streets bylaw. Do contact your city councillor and tell them it's a crazy thing. We've also jumped into the Toronto community housing debate. You've heard a lot about why Toronto community housing should not be for sale. There's a certain element of deja vu about this, because I remember in 1995, days after the Mike Harris government was elected in Ontario, they had the bright idea that they would sell off the entire Ontario Housing Corporation, as it was then known. Much of it is now part of Toronto Community Housing, but the Ontario Housing Corporation stock. And at first we thought that was stupid, because who would want to buy a bunch of housing that was frankly in a bad state of repair, and tenants who you couldn't actually jack up the rent, you couldn't make a lot of money out of the tenants, who would want to buy it? Well, it turned out that Citibank, the big American financial giant, wanted to buy it. And why did they want to buy it? Because they thought they could kick out all the tenants redevelop the housing, Susan, prime real estate all around Toronto and across Ontario. And we fought then, and we succeeded in convincing grudgingly the Ontario government not to sell Ontario Housing Corporation, and they then decided to download it instead. But now they're up for sale again, and the one thing I want to just add to you, you've already heard from Susan, and she's told you all the reasons why this housing is not for sale and why the tenants are not for sale. And you've heard from Joy about how they're to get 2 or 3 sensible people in the room. But I just want to tell you that one thing that surprised me when I looked into the numbers at the Toronto Community Housing was that the so-called standalone portfolio, which is where most of the units that are being proposed for sale come out of that portfolio, it actually generates revenue for Toronto Community Housing. It's not that it costs money, it generates revenue. And the figures, it's actually a net operating income of $1.5 million. And the only reason why it actually ends up being a liability is because of this capital repair bill that you've already heard about, that the housing was badly maintained. In some cases, the capital repairs haven't been kept up. Well, when you have a positive cash flow of $1.5 million a year on these properties, you can actually use that cash flow to help to go and get capital financing. And as it happens, our Ontario government has hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the Affordable Housing Loan Fund through Infrastructure Ontario that it wants to give to housing providers at a very low rate to do retrofits, repairs, energy upgrades, all that sort of stuff. And Toronto Community Housing can actually repay the money that it borrows from that using the positive cash flow. So that's one idea we put on the table in addition to all the great ideas that you've heard from Joy and from Susan. And we do think at least we need to actually get some smart people who care about housing, most importantly the tenants living in the housing, to the table and have a sensible and adult discussion about how we ensure that tenants live in good homes that are properly maintained, up to proper standard, and that they are fully engaged in all that process. So that's a quick run through of the budget numbers. There's some information at the back, and this presentation is on our website, so if you want to go to our website, it'll be there tomorrow morning anyway, so you can get some of the numbers there. And I'm going to look forward, as all of you do, to jumping on my bed with great joy and delight first thing Monday morning, and like Christmas morning, and opening the budget, and just to see exactly how it is that our executioner-in-chief plans to make that 10% cut to shelter housing and support. Thank you.